been collecting questions as we've been going through the event. And what I'm going to do is just kind of go through those. And I'm going to direct the questions at a particular speaker. But then once they answer, if there's any other comments from any of the other speakers, I'd just like this to be a free-flowing, open discussion around these specific questions. So in no particular order, Thornton, we have a question. What is a biofield viewer detecting? And what are you actually seeing when you look at one? Light at what frequency, wavelength, EMF, etc.?
Well, I'll try and weave in the other presenters' perspective in my answer, because the biofield viewer is one of, I think, the world's first fractal imaging technologies. We look through a fractal at a fractal. So we're using non-linear programming in its development. But to give people a very clear idea, the biofield viewer technology can be used through a microscope, through a telescope, through a probe, through any kind of camera, including thermal imaging or ultraviolet. So it's a technique. Some of our doctors around the world import MRI, PET scans, CT videos and images into the biofield viewer, because they then see more detail in those images. So it's a technique that we use in the visible spectrum, but as the people who come to use it realize it straddles the visible spectrum in the same way that thermal imaging and ultraviolet imaging does, and allows us to see a little bit more of what's going on. But because it's a live system, it's used in a number of different applications, from doing healing research to therapists using it to direct themselves where an individual needs healing. I would be fascinated to apply our technology to the kind of detailed understanding that Joan has. And I think the time is right, because our system is now available online. And so anyone who's got a computer and a video camera can develop themselves their biofield image. And even without any guidance, there's an opportunity to track the progress of their own personal journey. So I think, as many of the speakers have addressed today, this is a new scientific age for us to explore and therefore integrate the best of everything that we are in a more conscientious and humbled guardian and steward of this planet.
Great, thank you, Thornton. You mentioned Joan's, some of Joan's work, and one of the questions that we had for Joan was, in your experience, Joan, you mentioned how rare certain types of awakenings are, specifically those that go all the way up and activate all 7 centers. In your experience, sort of how rare are those awakenings versus other types of awakenings like deflected awakenings?
Of the 3 I mentioned, Brahmanati is extraordinarily rare. Once in 1,000 years, maybe. They are the great world teachers, anointed by the divine. Chitrini does open each chakra sequentially, purifying it and yielding the gifts and knowledge of each chakra along the way. It is very rare. And it's difficult and it takes years from beginning to the culmination, but it yields somebody who really understands Kundalini process. My teacher had that kind of process. The third, Lakshmi Nadi, is not so great, so I won't talk about that one. Usually the stories of rushing up the spine and fireworks in the head would likely be a Vajranadi experience, although it could have other possibilities. I don't want people to go self-diagnosing. After a talk one time, a man come up and said, well, I had a Brahmanadi rising. Okay, then. Because there's always variations and other explanations. But the thing about Vajra is it would go back down to Muladhara and second chakra after that. And not everybody with Vajra gets that kind of experience.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Another question for you, Joan, was can a Kundalini process become stalled? And if it feels stalled, what can a practitioner do?
Yes, that's what I call stuck. And certainly they would have to do all of the prerequisite lifestyle things that I listed. Healthy spiritual lifestyle, really spiritualize the intent. Thank you for mentioning self-care, very important. And ask for divine assistance. The sincerity toward the spiritual endeavor, progress, a really heartfelt need for it, or it could be stated dualistically, I need God more than anything. That kind of motivation can get you unstuck. But it really often requires some kind of life change in a person's way of living and their mental, emotional orientation. And also the correct, effective spiritual practices for the kind of rising that they have, and for whatever spiritual tradition they may have been brought up in or have an affinity toward, because those will work better with their individual prana system. Yeah, it's not easy. Be patient. The reason to ask for the divine is because synchronistically, good guidance can come. The second email address that you provided can actually provide some guidance. I'm not taking new consultees right now, however.
So you mentioned guidance, and we have another question that's related. Is can the developmental process chosen? Let's see. Can the developmental processes chosen or directed with a mentor? I think we may have copied that a little funky, but I think the general question is, using a mentor, what's the value there, and sort of maybe what should someone look for?
Yeah, it depends on the level of the mentor. If you want, a good counselor, find someone who's, I'd say, licensed, because I know they have the education and supervision and hopefully experience, and a spiritual orientation, and that they can understand weird things without saying, oh, well, you're psychotic. That can be tremendously beneficial, because people need education and often calming down, and to put it in context and perspective. For spiritual guidance, you need a virtuous, well-educated in their particular spiritual tradition, in the mystical branch, I should say, of their spiritual tradition, and very spiritually advanced. At least lower brow, at least Makara, hopefully Bindu, if you can find it. Bindu's good.
Great, thank
And
you.
beyond.
All right. So, earlier we were hearing talks from Ben Decker and Zeus, who were talking more about, the systems, let's say the control systems that each of us is sort of embedded in, political and economic. And, a lot of us, I think right now, feel like we're kind of at the mercy of the forces at work, whether they be coronavirus or, our political system. And I think what people are beginning to look towards now is practical, everyday advice, things that they can do to really just help themselves and also help society sort of make these incremental changes. And Zeus, you talked a lot about different ways of approaching that. I guess if you had to sum it up, what are sort of a few practical ways that the average person might be able to get involved in the process to help revise our current economic systems? And I know you spoke about that, but if you can help summarize for the group, that'd be great.
Well, I think the number one thing is demand. The organic food movement worked because though there was a lot of propaganda, a lot of dark stuff, a lot of pretend natural foods and so forth that were laden with chemicals, people educated themselves, informed each other, and chose not to purchase those crappy foods. And they supported local farmers, and they supported farmers markets. The way that you move this world in the right place on a concrete level is to use higher principles, clear mind, open heart, active hands, right? That's the part that gets left out all the time, right? Everyone's right with their mind, they're thinking the good, positive gratitude thoughts. They're right with their heart. They're going to try to be open and compassionate and accepting. But you have to have a critical mind as well. That translates into the action of the hands, not just individually, but to organize with other people to do these sorts of things. And the organic movement worked. These big corporate farms try to water down the label of organic. Citizens groups fought against it. They probably would have gone into alternative labeling. And I would have followed that as well. So that, those forces have to be actively told no. And that's one thing spiritual people aren't able to do very well. Don't usually have very good boundaries. Don't say no, I will not stand for this, period. This nonviolent civil disobedience is one of the most powerful forces in the world. It's linked with ahimsa, non-harming, but it's also a powerful, powerful force. It is superior to these forces of darkness because those forces of darkness need creative energy and innocence to run them. They can't create their own. They need our agreement on a certain level. And when we say no and do not agree to that, and we say yes to concrete level, the level of hand, not just heart and mind and soul, but the level of hand, then we change the world. The organic movement shows that, but that same lesson can be applied to politics, economics, across the board. We simply withdraw our energy, okay, from things. I was going door to door for Bernie Sanders out here in California. A woman that I was with, very progressive woman, but she had all of her stocks invested in finance companies, JP Morgan, et cetera. So I'm like, what are you doing? Even if it's making you money, okay, please take your money out of the things you do not agree with, okay? There are good returning social investment funds. I just invested in a vegan startup up in British Columbia, $25,000. She had an amazing product. She sent it to me. She's got good mentoring from the guy that started Day of Cheese, okay? That's one example. Remove it out of these big companies, do your research and put it toward the world you want to have happen. So that's just two really great examples right there. I'd be willing to do a session just on other ways of doing this. But think about the world you're creating in that. It's going to be a world much more hospitable to Kundalini. It's going to be a world that's much more hospitable to not just individually experienced, but shared experiences, higher consciousness, to use your term. So that's what I would say to that.
And that's some great suggestions, and really, I think, actionable by just about anybody. I guess taking it one step further in terms of the evolution of our economic system and getting kind of closer to ideal, how do you see sort of that unfolding, let's say over the next 10 to 25 years, assuming that humanity is able to sort of take some major steps in the direction of a more sort of egalitarian, less divided culture and economy?
Well, I think a lot of the things that have come out within the progressive movement are the directions we're going to need to head for that to happen. A lot of work is being automated. That production from that work should be distributed in the form of some kind of, if not universal basic income, then some kind of premium, right? That's given to every single man, woman, and child. I think nature, I'm really encouraged by the fact that Biden may actually hire a Native American woman as the Department of Interior. Absolutely unprecedented. If you're going to have someone who knows how to preserve the world and the country, hello, why not get someone who truly is from the blood and the heart of that sacred culture that is taking care of the earth? We need people in positions of power like that who actually have wisdom and craft understanding of what it means to protect the earth. So that's an example. I think also Medicare for all, beginning to declare human rights across the board right now in things that have been commodified, right to water, because there's been a big push to try to commodify and privatize water, okay? The right to healthcare, and not sick care, not institutionalized, throw medicines at you, but holistic preventative focus. I'm part of Kaiser, which is a nonprofit. They focus on preventive care. Why? Because it actually saves them money, right? Within their organization, if you actually have active preventive care. So if we were to have an economy that was interested, Medicare for all would alone save $500 billion a year. $500 billion, $500 billion a year. Getting rid of parasitic middlemen is going to be absolutely critical. And this is where citizens can stand up and make sure that happens. Making sure people eat well, not have crappy foods. And again, all of these things are going to be militated against in the current system, but our demand can help that happen. I have a whole, on citizenzeus.com, I believe I did put it up, which I went through big oil, big pharma, how you can resist each one of these with an alternative. I'll get that link to you if you like, people can actually look through it. But these are just some of the examples of that. Oil, and we have an electric car. I just say, okay, you want to get rid of oil, start buying electric car. Now that has its own environmental impact. I do understand that. But again, think about it. I mean, the metaphor of the sun, which is radiant and golden, non-scarce, which is exactly what I'm trying to help people toward, and the mucky oil from deep down in the earth, which is scarce, and it's literally black and gooey and made out of dead animals and plants. It's like, it doesn't take a genius to figure out which one is higher frequency, right? So again, we just need to apply our spiritual knowledge in a little sort of greater capacity. I don't think there's any judgment necessary. You don't have to cast off the evil spells in the dark as much as you have to say, no, will not do that. Standing up to that, okay? People talk about boundaries. Don't even talk about boundaries. Say, this is who I am. I don't need a boundary, and I don't need to agree to this, okay? I agree to something healthier. I agree to something higher. And this is where the techniques, Kundalini techniques, are used to help. but they cannot be a replacement, and they cannot be an escape from the world, which a lot of people, and I'm empathetic to this move because it's a tough world, because these powers are making a really big thrust right now, but we can stand up hand to hand and make sure that, you know, this doesn't happen, that it goes through. So, so those would be a couple of examples.
Thank you so much. That I love a few things that you touched on there. And before we move on, I do want to honor the first peoples from this land on which I stand on, which are the Tongva and the Chumash here in Southern California, Rancho Cucamonga. So thank you for that. Go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things that, interestingly, that Linda uses with our children to teach them is a concept of biomimicry. And, you know, it's looking at nature for patterns and for insights into our technologies and sort of, you know, the way that we look at the world. And, you know, you mentioned concepts like universal healthcare and income. And I think when we look at nature, you know, the food, water, habitation, all of those things are sort of freely available to creatures, you know, on this planet. But it's humanity that sort of tries to make these things scarce for ourselves. So that's a really interesting sort of concept there. Speaking about nature, sort of, you know, Meredith, you were talking about patterns that exist in physics and in our bodies. You spoke about fractal anatomy sort of from a conceptual standpoint. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how to apply that fundamental understanding of fractal anatomy to the healing of the body?
Yeah, I also want to kind of riff off of what Zeus was saying, because yeah, I have some thoughts around that. Can I just kind of go on that for a moment?
Yeah.
So Zeus, I really appreciated the insights that you gave around, you know, what's beneficial, what has happened for us by having COVID, and the reflection and, you know, just the general idea that we're going into more of a parasympathetic mode, and the shift and the change. And I agree with all of those things. And I agree with everything that you just said about the kind of changes that need to happen. What comes up for me is that as soon as we say no, as soon as we, you know, create, and as you say, there doesn't have to be boundaries, but there is this very powerful ahimsa kind of idea of being able to really resist and shift the common narrative. Mm-hmm. And what I'm feeling really concerned with, and I would like your or anyone's perspective on this, is that even with what's currently going on with COVID, my concern is that as soon as the common narrative is questioned in any way, as soon as we start asking questions, which is required when we're changing, you know, anything that you talked about in relation to the direction that we can go, which is very positive and has a high, you know, resonance to what it is that we're doing. It requires questioning. It requires creative lateral thinking, and it requires a person to stand outside of the common narrative and start asking questions. Yeah. And what I've been really concerned about this year is the fact that as soon as any questions are asked, and I'm a question asker, I suddenly get called, you know, a Republican conspiracy theorist.
Right.
And this, you know, this middle ground, there doesn't seem to be a centrist position. There doesn't seem, you either have to go with the common narrative and you have to do all of the protocols and not ask, why are medical authorities not talking about immune system? Why are we not being self-empowered? Why are we not being encouraged to work with the addictions and the high suicides that are going on? Why are we not having, you know, some psychological support in the midst of this, or having that be encouraged? Why is fear being promulgated so much? And that's without going into what, you know, there are many, many medical doctors who are putting their careers on the line to say things that aren't common narrative, who are getting pulled off, censored, and shot down. And as soon as and I don't mean literally shot down, hopefully that will never happen, but you know, and so I'm with you on the idea of progress and how that needs to happen. And this year has really disappointed me in seeing how little room there is for actual questioning in any other direction, and that you've either got to be in one extreme or another extreme. And we cannot have the kind of movement that you're talking about without the individual right to question and think for oneself. And that is in no way being promoted. And I just wanted thoughts on that, because
absolutely. In fact, this is the very subject that my wife and I did it in our last interview. I'd encourage each one of you to see it. It's on reginameredith.com. And it's the latest interview up there. we discussed the neoliberal and the neoconservative aspects, which are trying to dominate the world right now. And as an alternative to that, I talked about old school conservative, old school liberal, and what I call new school progressive. Right now, the COVID, I've done a whole series on COVID in which I directly take to task both the neoliberal and the neoconservative approach. The technocratic, medical establishment, mainstream news media approach is inculcating fear. It's illegitimate. The fear itself that they're inculcating is one of the worst things you could do for COVID. It's creating that active, sympathetic, keyed up version when your body's needing to do the exact opposite. It's inflammatory, and it's also externalizing your authority, right? Oh, that vaccine is going to do it for you. This medical authority is going to do it for you. No, if there is ever a disease in which your own personal health and sovereignty was important, it's this one. You get the vitamin D, and I go through this, CBD, you get the nitric oxide from the nasal breathing. It goes on and on. If you get someone on those regimen, that's going to be better than every one of those vaccines, I guarantee you, okay? Because the vaccines themselves, if you actually look at them, some of them aren't even vaccines. They're kind of like, they're not vaccines in the typical sense. They're supposed to help with symptoms. And I was just reading this straight off of a news, and I'm like, this is not really a vaccine. This is actually, so a lot of those promises are false promises. It's an effort to try to get back to the old way of doing it. That way is over. Now you've got the nationalist, neoconservative, fascist, racist, neoconservative. Ignorance is what drives them. So you got fear on one side and ignorance on the other. Well, we don't need fear and we don't need ignorance either. They're saying that this whole thing is a hoax. And then they have competing conspiracy theories when one person says it's not a hoax, but it's going to be done by November 3rd because it was only there to get Biden elected, and it goes on and on. It's really mentally ill. Almost none of it is coherent. It's almost all delusional. So you are correct. We need the ability to question and understand the motives of both of them. What do the motives do both of them have that's in common? The desire for dominance, okay? That's one motive, okay? One's basically an aggressive form. The other one I said was a passive aggressive form of the same desire to reassert the past and an old regime of certain people above other people. So if we look at that and we look at what they have in common and don't be lulled into pretending they're opposites, they're not. They're partners in this, okay? They're trying to hold the law, the line of dark energy in here, okay? Now, what's the alternative to neoliberal and neoconservative? Old school conservative says wisdom is important, tradition is important, accountability is important, responsibility is important, virtue is important, okay? Conservation of even of the environment could be called conservative, old school conservative. All those are absolutely critical for us to have a foundation. I honor those. I'm part old school. I say I'm a third old school conservative. The other part is liberal. The old school liberal, that is caring for the least of these, belonging, acceptance, care, absolutely critical, okay? Franklin Delano Roosevelt, making sure old people weren't dying in poverty, which is what they were doing beforehand. Kids were not simply being made to work. That only changed in the early 20th century. So that's absolutely critical. So you have wisdom, you have care, and then you have co-creation. And that's the new school progressive that says, okay, some of these things I just talked about and the other answer had to do with this mentality. So you're absolutely right. We have lost the ability to be critically thinking. We've been snowed into believing that individual subjective feeling, and this is true spiritually as well, is all that matters. It doesn't. It's the inner connected to the outer that matters. In other words, results matter. Empirical facts matter. And empirical facts, when you investigate and research, as I have, really show the reality. Months ago, because I looked at news reports, I said, this is a blood immune nerve disease, COVID. No one was saying that. I said this in June. I have them on my site to say it. Guess what they're now discovering in so-called modern science? Oh, it's an autoimmune disease. Duh, I said that 4 months ago because I was using my mind to look at the way it operated, okay? So if we use empirical reality as an ally, we can question both the so-called experts and the technocrats and the people who are just way off the edge of the cliff. And we can set forth a new and an alternative path, which is based in empirical reality, critical thinking, creative engagement, and loving interaction based in civil disobedience against the things that are wrong, and active co-creative forward movement in the things that are right and spiritually attuned. It's a craft, and we all have to help each other on that.
Right, and here's a fractal consideration within that. And this is what I'm going to take away with me today to just really ponder. You know, when we're talking about the idea, whether we're talking about COVID or whether we're talking about World War II and the Holocaust, or whether we're talking about various other things that have happened all throughout history, there is always the one side and the other, and the mainstream pull, and this resistance to asking questions, this resistance to this need for authority on such levels that we actually create a prison out of our freedom. And you know, and that's really, you know, a political model, we'll call it, and I call it a fractal because it doesn't really matter what the story is, it doesn't really matter what time and place it happens. It's the same dynamic. And so to kind of answer your question, and I'll get into the body, Michael, but the idea that until one can see a pattern, until one recognizes that, you know, we're not just talking about COVID anymore, and we're talking about progression and your progressive ideas, for instance, and the ways that we can go, until we can really look and crack the code of the pattern, we can't really make a shift. And the cracking of the code in this particular pattern is, you know, the simple question for me is why am I not allowed to ask questions right now? Why is that not good? And so I'm going to just reflect on that from this, because it's like, as soon as I see pattern, then I just start thinking, and okay, so what is the solution to the actual pattern? And then it can unlock other patterns. And so that's an example of a fractal. It's a pattern that repeats itself over any scale and creates iterations, you know, from the small to large, like Russian dolls. So this discussion even in itself shows a fractal patterning to things. So thank you for entertaining, you know.
Can I ask you a question real quick, Meredith?
Yeah.
What does it say about your own emotional patterning? Because I would say to that, of course you can ask questions.
My society doesn't tell me that's okay. And neither does Facebook. And neither does my local next door thing where we circle around and I see somebody say that they're upset about the lockdown because of this or this or this, and they just get censored and they get pulled off. And I think, well, if we're allowed to talk about how everyone's upset about how everyone should be wearing a mask, why aren't the people who are upset that everyone's having to wear a mask don't have a voice either? Why are people getting pulled off Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park when that stands for, in England, when that stands for free speech and freedom of speech? My society doesn't tell me it's okay to ask questions. Some of my friends don't think it's okay for me to ask questions. And as soon as I open my mouth, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. No, I'm not. I'm asking questions about what's going on. So that's why I bring it up, because it is emotional for me, because it makes me feel forced to follow a common narrative that concerns me when no one's asking questions. And this is a pattern that repeats itself over history when we really look at our history, and causes a great many of the social upheavals and warfare that has happened in the world. And I'm scared if we're not asking enough questions, we're just going to go down the same siphon. And I want to encourage questioning, and it's not encouraged in this society.
Well, to me, the foundational metaphysical principle, and this could be a conference in and of itself, is why do people feel the need to give up responsibility?
Because they crave authority. Wilhelm Reich had a really good foundational piece about all of that. You know, people require authority figures and being told what to do so much that they will really create a prison out of what it is that they are trying to gain freedom from. So again, that's another pattern that repeats itself in human psychology.
The spiritual innovation to break that pattern would be, how could responsibility be a glad thing instead of a burden? I think that part of the reason why people are trying to give up responsibility is they're seeing it as a burden instead of as an enhancing, enlightening tool.
I agree.
Like responsibility, like being able to respond to each other, to nature, and to enjoy that connection is something that we don't see. We've been programmed to believe it as a burden and as a challenge. We programmed to look at difference as a threat. Now we can break that fractal pattern and switch it and to look at difference as an opportunity and as a delight.
Yep, by thinking outside the common narrative. I entirely agree with you, and I think that it is a symptom of a spiritually advanced culture who can start to think independently and take responsibility as something that is co-creative. Yeah, I agree with you.
I think that's part of the value of the research into this evolutionary process, which is basically to say to each one of us that you have inside of you this enormous potential that has been unrecognized, and to unlock it actually requires taking full responsibility over this process unfolding within you. You can't rely on authority. You can't rely on anything. You need to take 100% responsibility over this process. And so then it becomes a question of, well, now how can I actively help cultivate? I think we're in a culture where the majority of people in the workplace are unhappy with what they do. We're in a society of sort of burden, and I think giving people the alternative, which is to say, you're not just here to work until you die. You're here to unfold, and putting that on a scientific footing would be one of the most beneficial things that we could hand to humanity. This generation to future generations. I think so.
It's making the spiritual world scientific.
Mike, can I add one thing to the question on mentorship that I should have said, which is anyone well versed in a spiritual tradition and authorized by that tradition, by the elders or teachers, can be a good mentor. They may not be enlightened, which would be a spiritual teacher, but they can mentor you to get a good foundation. And I want to applaud what you guys are just discussing. Beautiful.
Thank you, Joan.
I have a question for Joan too, actually. And I know that you asked me a question, and I don't know if there's time for me to answer it. But
ask questions.
I like
How can you tell her no?
I loved your presentation, Joan, and it was wonderful to be able to hear all of those different levels. And it's so much that I am not familiar with in the understanding of Kundalini. There was, when you were talking about that Kundalini does not go up the Ita or Pingala side, I was remembering, because the Gopi Krishna book, Living with Kundalini, was really helpful for me, particularly at the time. And I remember him very distinctly because he describes 3 lines through the body. And that's what began to come up before I had even read that. I could feel 3 lines through my body, but very much as a spiral too. And in his book, he talks about how the reason that it had been such a horrible experience for him was that he could feel activity up the right line. And then at some point in the base of his spine, he had a huge amount of energy that started to build up, and that he had been told that it was better to force it up the left line, which he managed, he said, to do with his mind. And it went up the left line, and it gave him the whole beautiful, blissful experience that then restabilized his experience. And that stood out in my memory, even though I read that book so many years ago. And I just wondered what you thought of that, because you know so much more about the.
Yeah. I can't, of course, talk about an individual's process without their permission, even posthumously. But theoretically, there are so many ways Kundalini process can manifest given the individual. I can say that the scriptures, although some would say otherwise, but I'd have to go into the whole thing about Vedic scriptures because there are contradictions. But as a whole, Ita and Pingala are not Shakti nadis, what we call Shakti nadis. They are energy nadis correlated with the brain hemispheres that join in Sushumna. And so when they are equally balanced, Sushumna is open. Gopi Krishna did not have, now I'm contradicting myself. He did not have, to my understanding, a deflected rising. He had complications, or it would not have been so extremely difficult and uncomfortable for him. It started out with puja and prayer, meditation. And the solution was also a spiritual one. And people with certain kinds of risings can feel their entire subtle body system. So they would be able to feel prana flow in nadis other than the one their Kundalini Shakti had been active in or is active in. Is that enough?
Yeah, it's all, I don't get everything.
Okay.
Well, I
Not
have
supposed to.
there's some information here from Terry Degler, who's been doing some research on the life of Gopi Krishna. And she states here that Gopi used the terms Ita and Pingala for his rising because those were the terms he was given.
Yeah.
But his whole point was we needed research to determine exactly what was happening.
That's great.
Thank you, Terry. Yes.
And thank you, Joan. That's great.
Ita and Pingala have become so popular as possibilities for Shakti, just, with modern repetition, as I said. It has truthiness.
So if they're not channels that Kundalini run up, what would you say they're doing there?
Oh, for the prana, there's 72,000 nadis that aren't Shakti nadis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
So I guess on the subject of anatomy, kind of going back to Meredith, your question, in applying fractal anatomy to the healing of the body, sort of, can you help describe kind of what that looks like in practice for us?
Yeah, it's still difficult for me to describe, and that's why I did the entire online program, because it goes through it bit by bit. So I always try to find a good short way of explaining it. And you can let me know if I'm cracking the code at all. So just like I was talking about how, that the hand or the foot or the eye or the ear can be a map of the entire body. Any part of the body can be a map of the whole. And so for instance, upper, middle, and lower, upper body, middle, lower body in the abdomen will relate also to upper, middle, and lower of the arm, which in the lower part of the arm could be upper, middle, and lower of the lower part of the arm. And then you could have the lower part of the upper part of the lower part of the arm. And it would keep going down in threes, down in threes, down in threes, down in threes, like Alice down the rabbit hole. And to make it sound really abstract, you could basically read your entire health of your body by your fingertip if you knew how to actually read it. You could read the entire nature and environment of the body through how, aspects of the diaphragm. Wilder Penfield tracked out the entire homunculus in the brain and found out that there were actually two people in the brain that mapped out exactly where you could stimulate a part of the brain and it would affect a part of the body. So we have these map works, and also the hypothalamus. Something came through recently showing that scientifically they're noticing that, I think it was the hippocampus. Homunculus. It was the hippocampus that that is also fractal in nature. So you're seeing the body represented on a small part. What the body showed me in the sensory experience that I had through the years of feeling things that I was not being taught in school and that I was not reading in books, eventually showed itself to be really a geometry in the body, particular points, as I showed in there, that are intersection points like traffic that get very busy. And I began to notice as I was working on bodies that I would touch a certain area and it would cause a release in another. And that was a whole process for many years that I went through working on bodies. So the shape that I showed in the picture of the kind of geometry that's actually is kind of like a 3D version of the Kabbalah, it turns out. There's a lot of theory behind this and a lot of, so yeah, I'm not just throwing out words and ideas. And I actually didn't know about any of these things until I ran into them. And then I would find proof about them. That there are areas, that shape and those connections and those intersection points are just one version of a fractal, but they're very practical for getting it into the body. So for instance, when we're thinking about, if we can just leave for a moment that there's a shape and idea of a tensegrity, as Buckminster Fuller called it, in the body that repeats itself from small to large. And if you want to freeze it at one point to get what's going on in your torso, instead of thinking about your neck or the top of the shoulder or that nagging pain behind your shoulder blade, and you stop thinking about your arm or your shoulder, if you start thinking about where one of these main intersection points is, which actually is very directly related to inside the lungs, and a lot of times where a lung cancer will develop. I'm trying to skip over a whole bunch of things to say. There's a point in here, and this is actually because we're like fabric. Body showed me we're like fabric. So if this gets pulled down, all of these areas get pulled even over into the arm. So I'm teaching people who work with their bodies through this lineage of somatic stretch, or therapists who work on the body, to stop thinking on the surface, but to actually think into core. And when you think into core, it's like your nervous system is watching itself watch itself, and it unlocks a little bit. And so people get huge release through tension and pain syndromes by understanding what I call organ system awareness, organ level awareness. And that's by really understanding that these subtle energy bodies that we're talking about are not, just chakras or just nadis or just different things, but that there's still actually enough information that we can pull together to show that we're looking really at geometry, and all geometry is frequencies of the nervous system, because we are frequency. And so that would make sense. And then on top of that, it's not even just light, it's not even just neural frequency, it's light refraction. And light is a phenomena that we don't actually really fully understand, I discovered in reading Lynn McTaggart's book, The Field, which is a great book. And, I just assume scientists understand light, but in fact we don't. And when we understand light refraction even more, we'll understand levels of how things are orchestrating themselves in the body to actually keep us healthy for as long as possible, and how our tensions and our emotions and our holding of breath freeze areas in the body that give us intersection points that are not just chakra based, but are also very physically active places that draw us closer to the interior. And that patterning ultimately is fractal. But that's where you'd have to watch the whole program to get that part. But the practical answer is you can work your calf and you can fix your back. You can work your upper, middle, lower of your calf and work with the upper, middle, lower part of your body. That's the most simplistic way to put it. I hope that makes a bit of clarity.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, historical context and support for that, even especially like in the Chinese cultures, and, Indra's web from India is,
Absolutely.
that the whole is contained in the part, and vice versa. And you were talking about, healing the body. And one question that we had here for Thornton actually was is from a healer. They're in their first semester as a cognitive science student. They were curious about the Biofield experiments and healing techniques that are being researched. So they were just curious, are you doing any research right now, or has there been research as far as healing specifically?
Well, yes, I mean, that does launch 1,000 ships for me, because for 30 years we investigated what I call the A to Z of healing in a well-funded research lab. The phase now, of course, is that people around the world have got access to this equipment. So we encourage people to do, the one-on-one studies which allow healers to learn and improve their skill sets whilst they're working live in clinic. One of the things that we're facing with the COVID is having to work at a distance, and the Biofield viewer allows us to screen an individual in their home environment, giving them confidence as they watch the progress of what you're doing, bringing symmetry and amplitude to their biofield. So as I said, I'd be happy liaising with the Emerging Science Foundation to create a link directly to any individual attending this conference or speaking at this conference who would want to see what that looks like. And we can set it up in the next few days. We can run it for a month or two, so that people can take unlimited images of themselves at different times of day and different states of being, and obviously healing and working with friends, because this is an era where we're shedding light on what has been up till now unseen. And as Meredith spoke, there's a lot of evidence in the sacred healing traditions that I've been studying that we really are a holographic expression, and iridology allows us to read the being in just the eyeball. The tongue readers can read the whole being in the tongue. The face readers, you can read the ear, you can interpret from a hair sample, from spit, from every facet of the diamond that is a human being. We can get a full investigation. And I mentioned face reading, but this is a 5,000-6,000 year old technique. So just with the Biofield selfie on your phone, you'll be able to look at a face map from Google and see where the kidneys and various other energy channels relate to. And if there are patterns in your face, you'll be able to address those issues. Maybe drink a little bit more charged water, or drink a little less cheap white wine, whatever it takes. So I'll hand the mic back to you, Mike, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to take over real quick. Thank you for that, Thornton. And you mentioned spit. So someone asked Stuart a question, and I know that he's not here, but he did provide an answer. The question is, so is this second puberty measurable in blood hormone levels, brain fluid levels? What other chemicals are active other than oxytocin? The answer that he provided was salivary immunoglobulin. Salivary immunoglobulin A levels are great tests for attained levels of the pineal hypothalamic puberty. Sorry, but that's the answer.
Great. I know we're actually at time.
No, actually we have 5 more minutes.
Oh, 5 more minutes. Okay. So I just wanted to open it up to the group for any questions or comments that anyone may have had. I know I've been asking the questions, but wanted to give everybody an opportunity to speak up if they had anything. Yeah, Thornton, I see Joan, and let's go with Thornton, and then Joan, we'll go with you next.
Well, I know my colleagues on the dais have all had a good engagement in our panel discussion, but I would like to speak to a cascade that is triggered by our focused intent. And I see it a bit like a focal point, in the same way the young strapping David took on his giant with, there was a fulcrum point in time and space that change was triggered. It's a foot out to the lemmings that we've become, that trip us into a new Eden. It's an opportunity for us to, as Rupert Sheldrake inspires through morphogenic resonance, it is an opportunity for a great awakening, where we don't have to play the game of snakes and ladders, but we can monopolize our true selves. We can land on go, and we can collect the proverbial 400. But as we look forward and we focus our intent on a sustainable relationship with nature, where the creatures are able to re-emerge from their small pockets and the apes can return to the canopy, then we can speak of peace on earth together.
Beautiful. Lovely.
Thank you.
I had a question for Thornton, but I must say I'm honored to be with both Thor and Zeus. What a coincidence. And Meredith also, although Anyway, Thornton, I wanted to know if the things that you were talking about with measuring biofields and even perhaps Kundalini process, are they available, did you indicate, now?
Oh, absolutely. There's certain technologies that we've had in our lab that aren't accessible, but I'd certainly love to introduce you to the developers of even those technologies, because I did a study with the Kundalini Research Foundation, and we used an adapted sonograph with 7 multi-channel sensors attached up the spine to duplicate some of the research done at Kaivalya Dam a number of years ago. But in terms of basic biofield technology, as I just said, our techniques available to you freely from this moment forward, but there are other techniques such as BioWell, which are relatively accessible in the sense that they're $1,000, $1,500 rather than, you know, mega expense. So any small research group can engage with a number of different devices, and I would recommend collaborating with an institute and a medical team so that you've got kind of both sides being monitored. But certainly the Biofield Viewer and the BioWell will give you 2 perspectives that will allow you to triangulate the Kundalini process. And because the Biofield Viewer can be generated from any video image, someone can send you a tape of them talking, and you can interpret what that type of Kundalini experience would be from the tracers in the subtle anatomy. So we're definitely at an advanced stage in supporting each other with the tools that integrate, as I think Stuart mentioned earlier. You know, we really are actually it was our keynote. You know, we really are at a stage where, you know, we're in a crucible. It's all real time. You know, we're all over the world here now. It's all real time, so we can collaborate globally. And of course, we all wear this sort of badge of intent. You know, what are we here for? And I don't consider myself a spiritual warrior, but I do consider myself a servant of the divinity in nature. And in that regard, I'm happy to serve each and any one of you with any needs you might have, both on this panel and in our audience.
Thank you, Thornton.
Yeah, likewise.
All right. So I think now we're officially at time. So just
Yes.
any final comments before we wrap up here?
I want to say to Zeus, exemplar, Gandhi.
Yeah, yeah.
No, no shy guy.
If you can take police clubs without striking back and show the entire world, or fire hoses and dogs, we need that same level of courage right now. We don't have the same requirement, but I think that we need to be able to do it in terms of being willing to stand up for each other.
Indeed. Yes.
Yeah, and it's always been a few people, you know, and humanity, our population, we are definitely larger. Our numbers are bigger against the small that control so much. So we definitely just need to come together, work together, and be willing to be of service to show, you know, the darkness that is out there through our own light, through our own peaceful ways, and through the suffering that we'll probably have to endure just to bring on and birth this new age that is coming. Thank you all so much for being here.